It was supposed to be an ordinary evening, the kind of evening where a hardworking woman finally returns home after a long day, craving only peace, silence, and the comfort of her own space. The neighborhood was quiet, lined with trimmed hedges and gated by an association that claimed to provide security and safety for its residents. But for one black woman, this place of supposed protection would soon become the stage for an ordeal that tested not only her dignity but the very ideals of justice in America. Her name was Commander Aisha Reynolds. To the world beyond those suburban walls, she was a decorated FBI tactical commander, a woman whose leadership had saved countless lives in operations that most people would never even know about. She was disciplined, respected, and above all courageous. But that night, the only thing visible to the man in the HOA security uniform was the color of her skin. Aisha pulled into her driveway, headlights cutting across the manicured lawns. She parked, tired but calm, gathering her bag and a folder of notes she had brought home. Just as she stepped out of her vehicle, the sharp beam of a flashlight cut through the night and landed directly on her face. She blinked, disoriented, then heard a voice, cold, commanding, and trembling with misplaced authority. "Stop right there! Hands where I can see them!" Startled, Aisha raised her eyes and found herself staring down the barrel of a handgun. A white man in a faded security uniform, the patch of the Homeowners Association stitched crookedly on his sleeve, had drawn his weapon without hesitation. His hand shook slightly, betraying both fear and aggression, as though her very existence had justified his violence. She froze, her FBI training immediately flooding her body with instinct. Calm the situation. Control your breathing. Don't escalate. But behind her measured silence was a storm of disbelief and anger. She lived here. She had paid into this association. She had walked these sidewalks countless times. Yet here she was, criminalized for stepping out of her own car in her own driveway, under the false judgment of a man who saw threat where there was none. "Sir," she began evenly, her voice steady despite the gun pointed inches from her chest. "This is my home. You are making a mistake. Don't move," he barked, his finger twitching dangerously near the trigger. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the neighborhood. You fit the description." Fit the description. Two words that black men and women across this country have heard too many times. Words that strip identity, humanity, and individuality in an instant. To him, she wasn't Commander Reynolds. She wasn't a homeowner, a neighbor, or a decorated officer who had dedicated her life to keeping Americans safe. She was simply a black figure in the dark, suspicious, dangerous, and therefore, in his mind, disposable. Aisha's heart pounded, but her face remained controlled. Years of tactical experience had trained her to maintain composure, even in life-threatening moments. She could see his stance, unprofessional and sloppy. She noted the lack of backup, the absence of real protocol. This wasn't law enforcement. This was a man with a fragile sense of power, armed with a gun and unchecked prejudice. "Listen to me carefully," she said, her tone low but commanding now, slipping into the authority she carried every day in the field. "I am reaching into my jacket slowly. I am going to retrieve my identification. Do not shoot me. Don't you dare move!" He barked again, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. His breathing grew erratic, as though the control of the moment was slipping from his grasp. For the first time, Aisha realized he wasn't just hostile, he was terrified. And fear mixed with a firearm is a deadly equation. She paused, calculating her next move. In her mind, the scenarios played out with tactical precision. If he panicked and pulled the trigger, her life could end before her neighbors even realized what was happening. If she lunged, she could disarm him, but then she would be branded the aggressor. If she tried to reason further, would his prejudice even allow her words to sink in? And then the irony hit her. This man, this so-called guardian of the neighborhood, had no idea that the woman he was threatening was someone who outranked nearly every officer he could ever imagine. She was the one who trained tactical teams in how to assess real threats, how to de-escalate situations without violence, how to see human beings instead of shadows. And yet here she was, reduced to a silhouette under the harsh glare of his flashlight. Aisha slowly raised both hands higher. Her voice softened, though her anger simmered beneath the surface. "My name is Commander Aisha Reynolds. I am an FBI tactical commander. You are pointing a gun at a federal officer in her own driveway. Do you understand the consequences of what you are doing?" For a brief second, confusion flickered across his face. His grip faltered. But then, like a man too deep in his own pride to admit error, he tightened his hold again, trying to reclaim dominance. I don't care who you are, he spat. This is a secure neighborhood. We can't just have strangers walking around at night. Strangers? Her jaw tightened. She had lived here for 4 years. She had chaired community meetings, spoken at local events, and hosted gatherings in that very house. Yet in his eyes, her presence after dark was intrusion. Her skin made her unfamiliar. Her existence somehow needed validation. At that moment, a porch light flicked on across the street. A neighbor stepped outside, startled by the commotion. She saw the scene, the gun, the stance, the fear etched on Aisha's face, and gasped. "What on earth is going on?" The neighbor cried out. The security guard turned his head just slightly, distracted for a fraction of a second. It was all Aisha needed. She stepped back slowly, her voice now ringing with unmistakable authority. "Put the weapon down, now, this is your last warning." The neighbor's voice added pressure. More lights clicked on along the street. Curtains shifted as others peered out into the night. Suddenly, the man realized the audience had grown. His illusion of control was unraveling. His hand trembled more violently. And then finally the gun lowered, hesitant, resentful but lowered nonetheless. Aisha exhaled slowly, her pulse still hammering in her ears. She did not lunge for him, did not disarm him, did not allow her fury to dictate her response. Instead, she reached calmly into her jacket, pulled out her badge, and held it high for both him and the neighbors now gathering outside to see. "I told you who I am," she said, her voice cutting through the thick tension of the night. "You just didn't want to believe it." Silence fell over the street. The guard's face flushed with shame, though his lips tightened in defiance. The neighbors exchanged horrified glances, the reality sinking in. A woman they admired and respected, nearly killed in front of them because a man with a badge of convenience decided her skin color was suspicious. But for Aisha, this wasn't just about survival. This was about dignity, about justice, about the reality that no matter how many medals she carried, no matter how high she rose in the ranks, there were still places, even in her own driveway, where her life could be reduced to a target under someone else's misguided aim. And as she looked into the crowd of neighbors, some whispering, some visibly shaken, she knew this was not over. This was not simply an incident. This was a story of bias, of danger, and of the strength it takes for Black women to stand tall in the face of it. But what Aisha would do next, the decision she would make in the aftermath of this harrowing night, would shake not just her community, but the very foundation of what people believed about safety, justice, and the power of identity. The night air was heavy with silence after the weapon finally lowered. The crowd of neighbors lingered, some whispering in disbelief, others shaking their heads as though they, too, had been caught in the crosshairs. Aisha stood firm, her badge glinting in the glow of the porch lights. She could feel her hands trembling slightly now that the danger had passed, but she refused to show it. Strength, after all, was not only her training but her armor. The HOA guard muttered something about just doing his job, but the words rang hollow. Everyone present knew what had just happened had nothing to do with protecting property or enforcing rules. It was about perception. It was about power. And above all, it was about prejudice. Aisha turned, her gaze unflinching as it settled on him. "You pointed a gun at an innocent woman standing in her own driveway. You threatened a federal officer without cause. This wasn't your job. This was your fear. And fear, when it wears a uniform and carries a gun, becomes deadly." The man looked away, his face crimson, his hand still shaking from the weight of the weapon he had almost used. He had expected submission. Instead, he was confronted with truth. Neighbors stepped closer, offering words of support, their voices filled with guilt, that it had taken the sight of a badge for them to believe her story. "We're so sorry, Commander Reynolds," one woman whispered, her eyes glistening. "This should never have happened." But Aisha didn't need apologies. What she needed was accountability. The next morning, she made the decision that would turn one neighborhood incident into a story that reverberated far beyond the gates of her community. She filed a formal report, not only with the local police department, but directly with federal channels. She wrote, in stark detail, the events of that night, the flashlight in her face, the gun pointed at her chest, the words that had reduced her to a stranger in her own home. And then she did something even more powerful. She spoke. At a press conference called days later, Aisha stood before cameras. The weight of her FBI uniform carried, not just on her shoulders, but in her very presence. She recounted the ordeal with precision and poise, her voice calm but resolute. Behind her stood colleagues, neighbors, and community leaders, all bearing witness to the story of how a decorated black woman, entrusted with the nation's safety, was nearly gunned down in her driveway by someone meant to secure her neighborhood. "I am alive today," she said, her eyes scanning the crowd, "because I kept my composure, because I am trained to survive in situations like these. But I should never have been forced to summon tactical training in my own driveway, just to prove my right to exist in my home. This was not protection. This was discrimination, and it cannot go unanswered." Her words struck deep. The story spread quickly, igniting conversations across social media and news outlets. Some viewers expressed outrage, others disbelief. But for countless black men and women watching, her story was achingly familiar. They saw in her ordeal their own encounters, the traffic stops, the suspicious glances, the moments where safety turned suddenly into survival. And what made Aisha's story different, what made it impossible to dismiss, was not just the badge she carried, but the undeniable truth it exposed, that even those who serve at the highest levels of protection are not immune to the dangers of bias. The HOA scrambled to contain the fallout. Statements were issued, apologies crafted, promises of retraining made. But Aisha refused to let the narrative end with shallow words. She demanded reforms, real training in de-escalation, mandatory bias education for all private security contractors, and accountability measures that would ensure no one else in her community, or any community, would have to endure what she did. Some resisted. Some whispered that she was overreacting, that perhaps the guard had simply been too cautious. But Aisha confronted those voices with clarity. "Too cautious?" she asked at a town hall meeting, her voice sharp yet controlled. "Caution is asking for identification. Caution is verifying facts. Caution is respect. Pointing a loaded weapon at an unarmed woman in her driveway is not caution. It is cowardice dressed as authority." Her words drew applause, but more than that, they drew reflection. In the weeks that followed, the HOA guard resigned under mounting pressure, though his exit was cloaked in bitterness. For him, the story had become humiliation. For Aisha, it had become something far larger than personal vindication. It had become a mirror, reflecting back to society, the raw truth of how quickly bias can turn safety into danger, how quickly fear can transform a neighbor into an enemy. But it wasn't just about exposing injustice. It was about reclaiming dignity. For Aisha, the ordeal did not leave her broken. It left her emboldened. She began speaking at community forums, sharing her story, not to center herself, but to highlight the countless voices that never made the evening news. Mothers who worried for their sons walking home. Fathers pulled over without cause. Children taught too early how to put their hands on the dashboard when lights flashed behind them. Her story, once a harrowing incident in a suburban driveway, became a rallying cry. She called it the driveway lesson, a reminder that the fight for dignity begins not only in courtrooms and protests, but in the most ordinary spaces, where the right to simply arrive home safely should never be questioned. Months later, as she looked out over a crowd gathered at a Black Lives Symposium, Aisha reflected on the irony of her journey. She had commanded tactical raids, negotiated life-or-death standoffs, and advised leaders on national security. Yet the most dangerous moment of her life had come not on the battlefield, not in an FBI operation, but in the quiet of her own neighborhood because of a man who saw her skin before her humanity. "I tell my story," she said to the audience, "not for sympathy, but for change. Because until every black woman can walk into her home without fear, until every child can play on their street without suspicion, until every man can drive without a gun drawn at his window, we have not achieved the justice we claim to believe in." The room erupted in applause, not for her rank, not for her medals, but for her truth. And though the night of the gun in her face would forever live in her memory, Aisha knew she had turned that terror into something greater. She had transformed it into testimony, into action, into legacy. Because in the end, this story was not just about a security guard or a homeowners association. It was about America itself, about the line between safety and fear, and about the courage it takes for one woman to stand tall in the face of both. And as long as Aisha Reynolds lived, she would ensure that her story was not forgotten. She would ensure it was told again and again, until the lesson of that driveway became more than just her survival. It became a step toward a world where dignity was not a privilege to be proven, but a right, finally respected. In the months after that night, life in the quiet suburban neighborhood shifted. The manicured lawns and flower beds were still there, but beneath the surface, something had changed forever. People spoke differently at HOA meetings. They watched each other more carefully, questioning not only the rules of the neighborhood but the silent assumptions that had allowed a man with a gun and a uniform patch to nearly take a woman's life without cause. For Aisha Reynolds, the change ran even deeper. She had returned to her FBI work with the same precision and discipline she always carried. But her colleagues noticed something in her presence that had sharpened. It wasn't anger, it was purpose. Her team asked her about it one day after a grueling training session. "Commander, you've always been focused," one of her agents said. "But lately it feels like you're fighting for something bigger. Like it's not just about tactics anymore." Aisha looked at him for a long moment before replying. "Because it isn't just about tactics anymore. It's about truth. And truth is harder to fight for than any raid will ever run." That truth found its way into places she never expected. Invitations poured in, from universities, advocacy groups, even members of Congress asking her to share her story. She was reluctant at first. She didn't want to become a symbol, didn't want her identity reduced to one harrowing encounter in her driveway, but she realized that silence would serve no one, least of all the young black women looking for someone to affirm that their lives and dignity mattered. So she spoke. And every time she told the story, she noticed the same reaction. Shock from those who had never imagined it could happen, recognition from those who knew it all too well, and a heavy silence from those who had no defense left for their disbelief. The HOA incident became more than a story. It became a catalyst. Legislators proposed new oversight for private security contractors. Advocacy groups launched campaigns, highlighting the dangers of unchecked authority in suburban associations. And neighbors, people who had once waved politely at Aisha without ever really seeing her, now came to her with questions, confessions, and sometimes apologies that revealed just how deeply bias had been woven into the fabric of their everyday lives. One evening, months after the incident, Aisha stood in her backyard, looking out at the fence line where her property ended and her neighbors began. A little boy from next door waved at her through the slats. He was no older than 10, his eyes curious, his skin the same deep brown as her own. "My mom says you're a hero," he said shyly. Aisha knelt down to meet his gaze, smiling gently. "Your mom is kind. But you know what makes someone a hero?" The boy shrugged. "It's not just standing up for yourself," she explained softly. "It's standing up for others even when it's hard, even when people don't want to listen." The boy nodded slowly, his young mind absorbing the weight of her words. And in that moment, Aisha realized what her story truly meant. It wasn't only about what had happened to her. It was about what would happen after, what would be taught, what would be remembered, and what would finally hopefully change. Still, the journey wasn't easy. There were nights when she lay awake replaying the image of the gun barrel aimed at her chest, the sound of the guard's voice shaking with false authority. Trauma, after all, doesn't vanish just because someone survives. It lingers in the shadows, reminding you that safety is fragile and dignity must be defended every single day. But Aisha refused to let fear define her. She turned it into fuel. At one national conference, she stood on a stage in front of thousands and shared the most vulnerable part of her experience. The hardest part of that night, she confessed, was not the gun. It was the realization that no matter how many years I served, no matter how high I rose, no matter how much I sacrificed for this country, I could still be reduced to nothing but a threat because of my skin. That is the reality we must change, not just for me, but for every black life. The room erupted in a standing ovation, but Aisha did not bask in the applause. Instead, she closed her eyes briefly, remembering her ancestors, the countless unnamed men and women who had faced the same dehumanization, without ever having a platform to tell their stories. She carried them with her, their struggles woven into her own, their courage echoing in her voice. Her activism grew, but so did the personal connections. In her own neighborhood, she organized community circles where residents sat together, stripped of titles, badges, and assumptions, to talk about bias and belonging. Some resisted at first, uncomfortable with the idea of confronting their own prejudices. But over time, those circles became a place of healing, where silence gave way to listening, and listening gave way to change. And through it all, Aisha remained grounded in the simple truth that had guided her since that night. Dignity is not a request. It is not a favor to be granted. It is a right that must be defended fiercely and unapologetically. Years later, when she reflected on the legacy of her ordeal, she understood that what had begun as an act of violence, nearly written off as a misunderstanding, had instead become a turning point. not just for her community, not just for her career, but for the broader fight to ensure that no black woman, or black man, or black child would ever again be forced to prove their right to exist peacefully in their own home. And in the end, that was the greatest victory. Not that she had survived, but that she had transformed survival into something far more enduring. A story that would outlive her. A testimony that would continue to speak long after the porch lights dimmed and the neighborhood fell quiet once more. Because Commander Aisha Reynolds was never just a victim of that night. She was a witness. She was a warrior. And above all, she was a voice that refused to be silenced. And as long as her story was told, she knew it would keep doing what it was always meant to do. Shine light into the places where darkness once pretended to be security. Years passed, but the memory of that night never faded. The gun's barrel, the guard's trembling voice, the silence of the neighbors. Those images were etched into Aisha's mind like scars that never fully healed. But time had given her perspective. What once felt like a wound had become something else. A story carried forward, retold, reshaped, and reborn into a legacy. By then, Aisha had retired from active FBI service. The medals and commendations hung neatly on her office wall, symbols of a career defined by bravery and discipline. But for her, the true measure of her life's work was not in plaques or titles. It was in people. She had become a mentor, not only to young black women entering law enforcement, but also to those who never intended to wear a badge at all. She spoke at schools, churches, and community centers, reminding students that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand tall in spite of it. One of her protégés, a young woman named Brianna, would often remind her why she continued. Brianna was in her 20s, fresh out of college, wide-eyed and determined. She had grown up hearing stories of Aisha's confrontation in the driveway, stories told to her by her grandmother who had lived in the same town. To Brianna, Aisha wasn't just a commander, she was proof that survival could be transformed into power. "I want to join the Bureau because of you," Brianna confessed one day as they sat across from each other at a cafe. "But I also want to change the way people like us are seen when we put on the uniform. I don't want to just fit into their world. I want to shape it." Aisha smiled softly, pride filling her chest. "Then you already understand the lesson. It's not about becoming what they expect. It's about being who you are without apology." Mentorship became Aisha's new mission. She launched a program called Voices of Valor, designed to connect law enforcement officers of color with communities who often feared them. The goal was simple: replace suspicion with dialogue, replace fear with trust. She knew it wouldn't erase centuries of pain, but she also knew that every bridge built was one less gap for prejudice to fester in. Meanwhile, her story continued to ripple outward. Books were written about her ordeal, and documentaries captured the moment when she held her badge in the glow of porch lights, defying the man who tried to strip her of dignity. But more important than the recognition was the message that grew louder with each retelling, that black life is not negotiable, that black dignity is not conditional, and that justice begins in the smallest spaces: driveways, sidewalks, living rooms, before it ever reaches courtrooms or Capitol buildings. Sometimes, late at night, Aisha would walk to the end of her driveway and pause. The memory of that night would resurface, sharp as ever. But instead of fear, she now felt something else: resilience. She thought of her ancestors who had fought far harder, battles with far fewer protections. She thought of the countless names who had not survived their encounters with bias and bullets. And she thought of the children, like the little boy who had once peered at her through the fence, who now lived in a world just slightly less hostile because she had refused to be silent. One summer, she was invited to speak at the graduation ceremony of a new FBI class. The room was filled with recruits in crisp uniforms, their faces eager, nervous, determined. She stepped to the podium, her voice steady, her gaze sweeping across the sea of fresh faces. "You will carry weapons," she began. "You will carry authority. But most importantly, you will carry responsibility. And I tell you this now, responsibility is heavier than any gun, harder than any badge, and more demanding than any order. It means seeing the humanity in the person before you, even when fear tells you not to. It means knowing that power is not given to you for dominance, but for service." The room hung on her words, silent and reverent. Then she added, her voice thick with emotion, "And if you remember nothing else from this day, remember this: dignity is not yours to grant or deny. It already belongs to every single person you encounter. Your only duty is to respect it." The applause thundered through the hall. But what mattered to Aisha was not the sound. It was the hope that maybe, just maybe, some of these recruits would carry her truth into their future. Years later, when she finally moved from that neighborhood, she left behind more than just a house. She left behind a legacy that had forced people to confront their prejudices, to change their policies, to question their silence. Her driveway had become a symbol, a reminder of how fragile safety could be, but also of how powerful survival could become when it was turned into a voice for justice. And so, when people remembered Commander Aisha Reynolds, they did not remember only the night a gun was drawn on her. They remembered the decades that followed, the lives she touched, the young women she lifted, the voices she amplified. They remembered a leader who had faced the worst of fear and turned it into the best of courage. Her story lived on not just as a cautionary tale, but as a beacon, a reminder that dignity, once defended, can never truly be taken away. And though the world was still imperfect, though the fight for justice was far from over, Aisha had given it something priceless, a lesson, a legacy, and above all, a living example that no matter how heavy the night, courage and truth will always find a way to shine. Time has a way of turning moments into history, and history into legacy. For Commander Aisha Reynolds, the night when a gun was aimed at her in her own driveway became more than a personal ordeal. It became a thread woven into the larger tapestry of Black life in America. Decades later, when her hair had grayed and her pace had slowed, her story was still being told, by classrooms, by activists, and by the very children who had once peeked at her through fences. She no longer wore the crisp lines of her FBI uniform every day. But when she walked into a room, the weight of her presence carried the same authority. She had lived long enough to see her protégé rise into positions of influence, judges, attorneys, agents, and community leaders who openly credited her guidance for shaping their paths. Many of them carried a copy of her memoir, The Driveway Lesson, a book that had become both a personal testimony and a rallying manifesto. Yet for Aisha, the greatest measure of success wasn't in awards or recognition, but in conversations. She treasured the letters she received from strangers, single mothers, thanking her for giving their daughters courage, young men telling her they had survived their own encounters, because her story taught them to stay calm, teachers explaining how they used her story to spark dialogues about bias and justice. One letter in particular stayed with her. It came from a young woman named Jasmine, a high school student who wrote, "I'm not afraid of the dark anymore.
Because I know someone."
Like you faced the worst kind of darkness and still found light." When Aisha read those words, she wept quietly. Not because of sadness, but because she finally understood the full circle of her journey. The terror she once felt standing under the harsh glare of a flashlight had been transformed into illumination for others. Her community had changed too. The same neighborhood where she once faced a gun now held an annual event in her honor, the Reynolds Forum on Justice and Community. Residents, leaders, and students gathered each year to discuss not only bias and discrimination, but also pathways to reconciliation and growth. What had once been a site of fear had become a space of dialogue, its legacy rewritten through resilience. Still, Aisha knew that progress was fragile. She had lived long enough to see victories in civil rights followed by backlashes, reforms followed by regressions. Yet she never lost faith in the slow but steady push of truth. The arc of justice bends only if we keep pulling, she would often say at gatherings, reminding people that their silence or their voice was always part of the outcome. In her later years, she took comfort in mentoring not just law enforcement officers, but also artists, storytellers, and community organizers. She believed the fight for dignity required every voice, those who enforced laws, those who wrote policies, and those who painted murals on city walls to remind the world of humanity's shared struggle. Her home became a hub for conversations. People came not just to hear her speak, but to sit with her in her living room, to sip tea while she listened, and to walk away carrying a piece of her wisdom. She was to her community part commander, part elder, part storyteller, a living archive of courage. On her 82nd birthday, her neighbors surprised her with a gift. In the middle of the community square, they unveiled a bronze sculpture, a woman standing tall, one hand raised, holding a badge in the glow of light. The plaque at the base read, "Dignity is not negotiable." Aisha stood before it, tears welling in her eyes as the crowd erupted in cheers. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, asking who the woman was. Parents knelt down and told them the story of the night when a black woman in her own driveway had turned fear into defiance, silence into voice, and injustice into change. She touched the cold bronze, her hand lingering as though bridging the distance between past and present. And in that moment, she felt a deep peace. Not because the world, was perfect, it never would be, but because she knew she had done her part to move it closer to justice. That evening, as the sun dipped low, she gathered her family and closest friends in her backyard. Her granddaughter, barely 15, asked her quietly, "Grandma, were you scared that night?" Aisha looked at her, her face softening. "Yes, I was terrified. But courage isn't about not being scared. Courage is about doing what must be done even when fear tries to stop you." The girl nodded, her eyes wide, absorbing the lesson the way a seed absorbs sunlight. Aisha smiled, realizing the torch had already been passed. For in the end, her story was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the generations who would carry it forward, reshaping it, retelling it, using it to fight their own battles in their own time. Her survival had become their inheritance, her dignity their shield, her truth their compass. And so long after the night in the driveway, long after the guard's flashlight and trembling voice had faded into memory, Aisha Reynolds lived on, not only as a name in a book or a face in a statue, but as a reminder. A reminder that dignity must be defended, that courage can transform even the darkest night, and that justice, though fragile, is always worth the fight. Because her life had taught the world one undeniable truth: guns can silence, fear can intimidate, and prejudice can wound, but none of them can outlast the power of a voice that refuses to be silenced. And that was the legacy of Commander Aisha Reynolds. The years were kind to Aisha Reynolds, but time, as it always does, eventually called her home. When she passed quietly in her sleep at the age of 91, her community mourned as though they had lost a family member. Her home, once the site of fear, then the hub of resilience, was draped in flowers. Candles lined the driveway where her ordeal had begun so many decades before, flickering like small flames of memory. News of her passing spread quickly, far beyond her suburban neighborhood. National headlines called her the woman who taught America a driveway lesson. Social media filled with tributes, each post carrying the same refrain: dignity, courage, justice. Young people shared clips of her speeches. Older generations retold her story to grandchildren, and strangers who had never met her still spoke her name with reverence. But perhaps the most profound sign of her legacy came not from the headlines, but from the lives she had touched without ever knowing it. In a small town in Georgia, a young officer named Malik pinned his badge to his chest for the first time and whispered, "This is for Commander Reynolds." He had grown up hearing her story in school, and it had convinced him that law enforcement could be a place not only of authority, but of service grounded in dignity. In Los Angeles, a filmmaker began work on a documentary tracing Aisha's journey, determined to capture not only the night of the incident, but the decades of impact that followed. "This is not just her story," she told her crew. "This is the story of every Black life forced to prove its humanity in the face of doubt." And in a classroom in Detroit, a teacher played a recording of Aisha's voice for her students. The woman's words filled the room. "Dignity is not yours to grant or deny. It already belongs to every single person you encounter. Your only duty is to respect it." The students sat in silence, the weight of the message settling on them. One girl whispered, "She sounds like she's still alive." And in a way, she was. Her funeral was not a somber affair, but a celebration. Hundreds gathered, some in uniform, others in everyday clothes, but all united by the same reverence. There were hymns, poems, and testimonials. Her protégé spoke of her wisdom. Neighbors recalled her kindness. Activists honored her courage. And her granddaughter, now grown and leading her own nonprofit for youth empowerment, stood at the podium with tears streaming down her face. "My grandmother always told me that courage was not about the absence of fear, but the refusal to surrender to it," she said, her voice trembling but strong. She lived that truth every day. And now it is our responsibility to carry it forward. The crowd rose in a standing ovation, as though they were saluting not just Aisha, but the movement she had sparked. After her passing, efforts to honor her legacy multiplied. Universities created scholarships in her name for young women of color pursuing law, justice, or public service. The FBI established an annual Reynolds Lecture on Dignity and Law Enforcement, inviting speakers to confront the intersection of authority and humanity. And across communities, murals of her likeness began to appear, her strong, steady eyes gazing out from brick walls, her raised hand holding the badge that once saved her life. But perhaps the most profound legacy lived quietly. in the daily choices of those who remembered her lesson, officers who thought twice before reaching for a weapon, neighbors who questioned their own assumptions, teachers who reminded their students that identity was not suspicion, parents who told their children that their worth was not negotiable. Her story became part of the collective memory, not as a tale of victimhood, but as a story of transformation. She had turned terror into testimony, silence into voice, and injustice into an unshakable demand for respect. Years later, when her great-granddaughter visited the bronze statue in the community square, she ran her fingers over the plaque that read, "Dignity is not negotiable." She looked up at her father and asked, "Did she really say that?" He smiled, his eyes soft with pride. "Yes, and she meant it." The little girl nodded as though accepting a gift passed down through generations. For her, the story was not distant history. It was family. It was inheritance. And so, the legacy of Commander Aisha Reynolds lived on, not confined to one driveway, one neighborhood, or even one lifetime. It stretched across generations, across states, across hearts. It became a reminder that one person's refusal to bow to fear could ignite a movement, that one woman's courage could echo long after her voice had quieted. Because dignity once defended does not die. It multiplies. It spreads. It becomes a light that others carry, ensuring that the darkness which once threatened to consume, it is never given the last word. And in that light, Aisha Reynolds still walked, steadfast, unyielding, eternal. That idea became a movement on campus. Jamal and his peers began organizing an oral history project, collecting first-hand accounts from neighbors who had lived through that era. Old voices trembling with age recounted the night when the quiet street erupted into sirens and spotlights, and how Aisha's calm defiance had turned it into a moment of reckoning. From those stories, the students produced a documentary titled Driveway Lessons, The Life of Aisha Reynolds. It was raw, unpolished, but it carried the pulse of authenticity. When it was released online, it struck a nerve. Millions watched. And once again, Aisha's story returned, not as myth, not as softened history, but as lived reality. The ripples spread quickly. In schools, teachers requested the documentary to show alongside textbooks. Community leaders used it in training programs, reminding security officers, police recruits, and neighborhood watch groups of the weight of their decisions. Lawmakers even cited it in debates about accountability and community safety. But perhaps the most moving moment came when Jamal and his peers were invited to present their work at the annual Reynolds Lecture hosted by the FBI. The auditorium filled with agents, officials, and community members. On the screen, Aisha's voice played, steady as it had been on the night. She diffused the man pointing a gun at her. "Stand down. Respect is not optional." Silence fell across the hall. When the lights rose, many in the audience were visibly shaken. A senior agent approached Jamal after the presentation, his eyes wet. "I was a rookie when this happened. I remember reading the report, thinking it was just another file. But hearing her voice now, I realize I've been carrying that lesson with me my whole career. Thank you for reminding us what it really meant." The students left that day with a sense of purpose. They understood that legacies were not preserved by marble statues or bronze plaques alone, but by voices willing to keep telling the story in its fullness. Meanwhile, Aisha's great-granddaughter, Layla, now in her 30s, carried the family torch in her own way. She was not a commander like her great-grandmother, nor an activist in the traditional sense. She was an artist. Her work combined sculpture, sound, and light, and she was determined to create something that captured the essence of Aisha's life, not as an artifact, but as an experience. Her installation, titled Stand in the Driveway, invited visitors to walk into a space recreated with soundscapes and shadows. A figure of a woman stood calm and tall, facing down the silhouette of a man with a weapon. Around the walls, Aisha's own words played on a loop, her voice filling the silence like a heartbeat. When the exhibit opened at the Smithsonian, people wept as they walked through it. Some clutched their children tighter. Others stood still for minutes, unable to move, as though the weight of the moment pinned them to the floor. Critics hailed it as not just art, but as a national mirror. Through these acts of remembrance, films, lectures, art, the next generation ensured that Aisha was not just remembered, but known. Not as an abstract figure, but as a woman who had lived, feared, loved, and stood firm. And yet the deeper truth was this: Aisha's story was never just her own. It was the story of every person who had faced the barrel of suspicion, every family who had wondered if dignity could survive in the face of prejudice. Her driveway was not just a driveway. It was every street where someone's humanity was questioned. That was why her story endured. Because it was not about the past alone. It was about the present. And the future, years later, when another young woman found herself confronted with authority that doubted her worth, she remembered the story of Aisha Reynolds. She remembered the calm voice that said, "Stand down," and with trembling hands but an unbroken spirit, she refused to surrender her dignity. The legacy lived not in stone or ink, but in the quiet courage of those who came after, because dignity once defended never dies. Years passed into decades, and the name Aisha Reynolds began to echo far beyond the neighborhoods where she had once walked. Her story, once whispered through community meetings and retold at family tables, grew into a beacon that crossed oceans. In South Africa, where memories of apartheid still lingered in the soil, university students read about her, confrontation in the driveway, as part of their studies on resistance. To them, she stood shoulder to shoulder with figures who had faced the violence of the state with nothing but unshakable presence. In London, murals of her face joined the walls of Brixton and Peckham, painted alongside other women who had carried both burden and torch. The quote most often written beneath her image was the one that seemed to outlive every telling, "Respect is not optional." In Brazil, where favela residents struggled daily against profiling and heavy-handed policing, grassroots groups began to cite Aisha's legacy in their campaigns. They called their movement Projeto Respeto, and in their rallies, young black women carried her image on banners. They marched with the same quiet fire that had once steadied her. Hand the night a gun was pointed at her. Her name even reached classrooms in Tokyo, where a professor of global justice told his students that the power of Aisha's story lay in its ordinariness. She was not seeking glory, he explained. She was returning home. That night could have been any night in any place. That universality is what makes her unforgettable. Through books, films, art, and speeches, her legacy became a kind of moral compass for the world, a reminder that dignity was not a Western value, not a privilege of class or status, but a human truth belonging to all. And yet, at the core of this expanding story, the most enduring memory remained the simplest. A woman in her driveway, weary from her day, standing against the weight of fear. That image, more than any speech or monument, carried the resonance that shook hearts across generations. In the United States, the National Museum of African American History and Culture eventually dedicated an entire wing to her. The exhibit did not glorify her as untouchable. Instead, it humanized her. Visitors saw not only her FBI uniform and commendations, but also her handwritten grocery lists, her family photographs, her well-worn Bible marked with underlined verses. The centerpiece of the exhibit was a reconstructed scene of her driveway, built from exact measurements. Visitors stepped into the space, guided by soft narration in her own voice. They stood where she had stood, faced the shadow where a gun had once been raised. In that silence, many wept, not because they were reliving violence, but because they were witnessing courage born from ordinariness. At the dedication of the exhibit, Layla, her great-granddaughter, delivered a speech. She stood at the podium, hands trembling, voice steady. My great-grandmother did not ask to become history. She asked to live in dignity. She asked to come home safely. But when dignity was threatened, she did not shrink. And because of that, she became a mirror for us all. If you see yourself in her story, that is not coincidence. It is truth. Her driveway is yours. Her courage can be yours. Her legacy belongs to you. The crowd rose to their feet, not just in applause, but in recognition. For in that moment, it was clear that Aisha's story had become more than memory. It was inheritance. Even within the halls of power, her name was invoked. Policymakers cited her story when drafting community protection laws, reminding themselves that the systems they shaped had real, human consequences. Training manuals for police academies included her confrontation as a case study, asking recruits to examine not only their actions, but the humanity of those they encountered. But the truest measure of her impact was not in policies or exhibits. It was in the small, unseen acts of courage that her story inspired. A mother in Chicago pulled over unjustly, remembered her calm, and found the strength to speak firmly without trembling. A teenager in Paris, profiled on the subway, thought of her words and refused to bow his head. A grandmother in Lagos, wrongly accused at a checkpoint, stood her ground with dignity that surprised even herself. Each of these moments was quiet, unreported, uncelebrated. And yet in those moments, Aisha lived again. Not in marble or ink, but in the human spirit refusing to be diminished. One evening, years after the exhibit opened, Layla visited the museum after hours. The lights were dim, the halls silent. She walked into the reconstructed driveway, standing where her great-grandmother had stood. For a moment, she closed her eyes. She imagined the fear, the weight of the night air, the gleam of a weapon aimed at her. And then she imagined the voice that had steadied, calmed, and defied. In the quiet, Layla whispered, "We remember. We will always remember." As she stepped out, she realized something profound. The story was not ending. It never would. Because legacies like her great-grandmother's do not belong to time. They belong to the human condition itself. And so, as generations continued to come and go, the story of Aisha Reynolds remained. Not just the story of a black woman, not just the story of an FBI commander, not just the story of a neighborhood confrontation, but the story of humanity itself, the eternal struggle for dignity in the face of fear, and the eternal truth that dignity, once defended, can never die. Her driveway had become the world's driveway, and in that shared space, humanity found both warning and hope. Because on that night, long ago, when a gun was raised and a woman stood still, the world learned a lesson it could not afford to forget. That respect is not optional. That dignity cannot be denied. That courage, even in the smallest of driveways, can echo across centuries. And that the voice of one woman, calm, steady, unbroken, can become the voice of us all.